Captain Henry Wallace was a man who never asked for attention. He had spent most of his life in quiet service to his country, standing tall in the red uniform of the Royal Guards. His medals shone proudly across his chest, but the one that meant the most to him was the Victoria Cross. It was not something he had earned easily. Behind that small piece of metal were years of danger, courage, and loss. Yet Henry never spoke about those things. He always said that he was just doing his duty, nothing more. That morning, the air at Heathrow Airport carried a soft chill. The sky outside was pale blue with streaks of gold as the sun began to rise. Henry arrived early, just as he always did. His steps were slow but firm, and his uniform was perfect, not a single wrinkle out of place. Even though he was now in his late 60s, he carried himself with the same discipline he had learned decades ago. He was flying to Edinburgh to attend a remembrance event, a ceremony to honor soldiers who had served and sacrificed. He had been invited as a guest of honor, but Henry didn't think of himself as special. He had only agreed to attend because one of his old friends had asked him to. "People need to see you there," his friend had said. "You remind them what loyalty looks like." Henry had smiled quietly and agreed. When he reached the check-in counter, the airport was already buzzing with travelers rushing to catch their flights. Children were crying, trolleys were rolling, and announcements echoed through the large hall. Henry waited in line patiently, holding his small leather bag. When it was his turn, he stepped forward, smiled politely, and handed over his ticket. The young woman at the counter barely looked up from her screen. Her tone was polite but distant. She typed for a few moments, frowned slightly, and then said, "I'm sorry, sir, it seems your seat has been changed. Business class is full. We've moved you to economy." Henry blinked once, surprised but calm. "Changed?" he asked softly. "Yes, sir. Due to an overbooking issue," she replied quickly, still not meeting his eyes. Henry could have told her about the event, about how the ticket had been arranged by the Royal Remembrance Committee, about how he was supposed to sit near other honored guests. But he didn't. He simply nodded. "That's fine," he said in a quiet voice. She handed him the new boarding pass, and he thanked her before stepping aside. As he walked away, a few travelers turned to look at him. Some recognized the medals, others simply admired the bright red uniform, but most went back to their own worries and screens. Henry found a seat near the window and waited for boarding. He watched planes rise and disappear into the sky, their silver wings glinting in the morning light. For him, travel was never about comfort. He had spent long nights in muddy fields, freezing trenches, and hot deserts. A smaller seat on a plane was nothing compared to that. But what quietly hurt him was not the seat. It was how easily people had forgotten what those medals stood for. When boarding began, Henry waited until the end of the line. He didn't like to rush or push. When he finally walked down the jet bridge, the flight attendants greeted him politely but without much notice. He smiled in return and walked slowly down the aisle. The plane smelled faintly of coffee and new fabric. Passengers were still finding their seats, arranging their bags, and arguing about overhead space. As Henry moved past the front rows, a few people noticed his uniform. One middle-aged man whispered to his wife, "Look, that's a Royal Guard." The woman smiled kindly. Another young boy stared wide-eyed at the medals and whispered, "Mom, is he a hero?" His mother smiled but didn't answer. Henry gave the boy a gentle nod and kept walking. His seat was near the back of the plane, beside a window. He placed his small bag under the seat in front of him and sat down carefully. The seat was tight and his knees brushed the one in front. Still, he adjusted his hat on his lap and looked out the window. Outside, the ground crew was moving luggage and the sunlight was brighter now. The man beside him was busy on his phone, barely noticing him. Henry didn't mind. He was used to silence. For many years he had stood guard outside royal gates, unmoving and silent no matter the weather. He knew the weight of duty better than anyone. After a few minutes, a flight attendant walked by. She glanced at his medals but said nothing. Another attendant followed, smiling at other passengers, offering help with seatbelts. But when her eyes fell on Henry, she paused for just a second. There was something in her expression, a flicker of recognition or maybe guilt. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but then someone called her from the front and she moved away quickly. Henry didn't think much of it. He closed his eyes for a moment and thought of the friends he had lost over the years. Faces flashed in his mind, young men with wide smiles standing shoulder to shoulder in old photographs. He remembered the sound of laughter in army tents, the weight of rain on his shoulders, and the cold nights when he had stood guard with only the moon for company. Those memories were his treasures. The plane began to fill completely now. Luggage compartments clicked shut, passengers buckled up, and the hum of engines grew louder. Henry looked around. No one seemed to notice him anymore. They were all lost in their screens, their own little worlds. He thought of his daughter who had told him the night before, "Dad, people may forget faces, but they never forget real kindness. Be yourself." That thought brought a small smile to his face. He didn't need attention or applause. He had done his duty, and that was enough. Still, there was a quiet ache somewhere inside him, a feeling that times had changed. In the old days, wearing the Victoria Cross meant something that people recognized instantly. It wasn't about fame or pride, but about the reminder that freedom and peace had a cost. Now it seemed like that meaning was fading, lost in the noise of a busy world. Henry took a slow breath and looked out the window again. The sky was clear. A gentle ray of sunlight rested on his sleeve, making the metal shine faintly. For a moment he just stared at it and thought of how life had come full circle, from battlefields to airport seats. As he sat there waiting for the plane to move, he didn't know that his quiet patience and simple grace were about to become the center of a story that would spread across the world in a matter of hours. Something unexpected was about to happen, something that would remind everyone watching that real honor can never be downgraded. And as the engines started to hum louder, Captain Henry Wallace simply sat still, his hands folded on his hat, his mind calm, unaware that destiny was already walking toward him from the Royal Terminal nearby. As the plane doors closed, Captain Henry Wallace settled quietly in his seat. The hum of the engines grew stronger and a soft announcement came through the speakers. The flight attendants walked through the aisles, checking seatbelts and bags. Henry adjusted his cap on his lap and looked out the window once more. The runway lights blinked in the distance and the morning fog began to lift. He felt a gentle tap on his shoulder. It was the man sitting beside him, a businessman in a dark suit. The man smiled politely and said, "That's quite a lot of medals you've got there." "Must have been tough work," Henry smiled back softly. "It was work that needed to be done," he replied. The man nodded but soon went back to his phone, scrolling through emails. Henry didn't mind. He had long grown used to short conversations. The world moved too fast now. People spoke quickly and forgot even faster. The flight began to taxi toward the runway. As it did, Henry's eyes drifted to the flight attendants standing in the aisle. He noticed how young they looked, smiling, busy, polite, but their faces tired from long shifts. One of them, a woman with kind eyes, caught his glance for a moment and smiled faintly. Henry nodded politely in return. When the plane finally lifted off, he felt the familiar pull of gravity before the smooth rise of flight. He had flown many times before, but each time felt different. He liked looking down at the shrinking city, the tiny cars and the long roads that looked like silver threads from above. There was something peaceful about it. As the plane reached its cruising height, passengers began to relax. Some took out their books, some pulled down the window shades, and others began watching movies. Henry simply sat still, his hands resting on his knees. His thoughts wandered, not to the event he was going to attend, but to the past that had shaped him. He remembered the first time he had put on his uniform as a young man. He remembered his mother's proud smile and his father's silent nod. He remembered standing in line during the first parade, feeling like part of something bigger than himself. Those were moments that had built his life. A flight attendant came by with a cart. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" she asked politely. "Just water, please," Henry replied. As she handed him the cup, her eyes fell on his medals. She froze for a second and then said softly, "That's the Victoria Cross, isn't it?" Henry nodded gently. "Yes, it is." Her expression changed. There was respect in her eyes now. "My grandfather used to talk about men who earned that," she said. "He said they were the bravest of all." Henry smiled kindly. "Your grandfather sounds like a good man." "He was," she said quietly, then moved on down the aisle. But she kept glancing back at him, as if she wanted to say more but couldn't find the words. A few passengers nearby had overheard. One woman across the aisle leaned toward her husband and whispered, "That's the Victoria Cross, it's rare." Her husband nodded, but soon turned back to his newspaper. Henry sipped his water and looked down at the floor. It didn't matter to him if people noticed or not. But deep inside there was a quiet sadness. The medal was not just a decoration. It was a memory of courage, pain, and friendship, all mixed into one small piece of metal. Every time he looked at it, he remembered the faces of those who didn't make it home. The plane continued smoothly, the clouds floating like cotton outside the window. Henry leaned back slightly, feeling a calm sense of reflection. He thought of how much the world had changed, how respect had become a rare thing often hidden behind screens and schedules. Suddenly, he heard a small argument at the front of the cabin. Two passengers were upset about their seats. The attendants tried to calm them down. Henry didn't look up. He had seen such things many times. People often lost patience over small matters, forgetting there were others around them who had faced much harder trials. A little later, a young boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, walked down the aisle with his mother. When they passed Henry's row, the boy stopped and stared at the medals. "Mom," he whispered, "is he a superhero?" His mother smiled and said gently, "He's something even better. He's a real hero." Then she looked at Henry and nodded respectfully. Henry smiled warmly at the child and said softly, "Remember to be kind and brave, young man. That's what matters most." The boy smiled wide and said, "Yes, sir." The small moment warmed Henry's heart. It reminded him that even if some people forgot, others still understood. After a while, the seatbelt light came on again. The captain announced some light turbulence ahead. Henry held onto his cap and looked out the window as the plane shook gently. A few passengers gasped, but he stayed calm. Years of service had taught him how to remain steady in much worse situations. When the plane leveled again, the same flight attendant came by once more. "Are you all right, sir?" she asked kindly. "Perfectly fine," Henry replied with a small smile. "I've been through worse weather." She laughed softly. "I'm sure you have." Then she hesitated and said quietly, "I'm sorry about what happened earlier. The seat change. It shouldn't have happened to someone like you." Henry looked at her, his eyes calm. "Someone like me?" he asked. She paused. "Someone who's given so much." Henry smiled gently. "Miss, every person gives something. I've just been given more years to show it." Her eyes softened even more. She nodded, unable to say anything else, and moved away. After she left, Henry leaned back and thought about her words. It wasn't her fault that he had been downgraded. Mistakes happen. But he couldn't help feeling that something larger was being lost in the world. The simple act of recognizing honor, sacrifice, and service. He closed his eyes again, resting quietly. Around him, people laughed softly, watched movies, and ordered snacks. The world continued as usual, but Henry's mind was elsewhere. Perhaps standing once again before the gates of Buckingham Palace, hearing the rhythmic march of boots on stone, or maybe remembering the day he had been handed the Victoria Cross by the late Queen herself. He remembered that day clearly, her gentle smile, the soft tremor in her hand as she pinned the medal on his uniform, and the words she had spoken. "Courage is not loud, Captain Wallace. It is quiet, steady, and everlasting." Those words had stayed with him all his life. Now, sitting in a cramped seat among strangers, he felt their truth more than ever. Courage was not about grand gestures. It was about patience, humility, and grace, even when the world failed to notice. The plane continued its calm journey north. The sky outside was turning brighter as they passed over the countryside. Henry could see green fields far below, dotted with small towns and rivers that glittered in the sunlight. It was a beautiful sight, one that made him feel at peace. He didn't know that far ahead, in another section of the airport, someone very important was also preparing to fly to the same event. Someone who would soon change the tone of this quiet journey entirely. For now, Henry remained unaware. He simply sat quietly, his eyes on the clouds, the sound of engines humming softly around him. He had no idea that fate was already moving, that in just a few minutes, his name would reach the ears of the king himself, and when that moment came, it would remind everyone on that plane that even in a fast and forgetful world, respect still had a heartbeat. The plane moved smoothly through the sky, surrounded by soft white clouds. The passengers had settled into their routines. Some were reading, others sleeping, and a few were busy tapping away on their phones. Captain Henry Wallace sat quietly by the window, his hands resting on his cap. His eyes followed the slow movement of the clouds, his mind lost in memories. He didn't know that something unexpected was about to happen, something that would change the atmosphere of the entire flight. A few rows ahead, the flight attendants suddenly began whispering to each other. One of them hurried toward the cockpit, while another picked up the intercom phone near the galley. Their faces looked alert but calm. The passengers didn't notice much at first, but the quiet tension began to spread. A few people leaned forward curiously, wondering what was going on. In the front section, the head flight attendant received a message through her earpiece. Her eyes widened slightly as she listened. She nodded quickly and whispered to her team. Then she straightened her uniform and walked briskly toward the front door of the plane. Outside, on the jet bridge, a group of airport security officers stood waiting beside a small royal convoy vehicle. Inside that car sat His Majesty King Charles III, traveling quietly and without public notice. He was on his way to the same remembrance ceremony as Henry. His plan had been to board privately, just before departure to avoid drawing attention. The king's aide, a calm man named Mr. Lawrence, walked ahead and handed over the official clearance papers to the airline crew. Everything happened quickly but quietly. The doors opened briefly and the king stepped onto the aircraft wearing a simple gray suit and a dark tie. There was no crowd, no announcement, no cameras. Only a few senior staff members and security guards accompanied him. When the king entered, the head attendant greeted him with a nervous smile. "Welcome aboard, Your Majesty," she whispered. The king nodded politely. "Thank you. Please continue as usual. I wish to travel quietly," he said in his calm, soft-spoken tone. He took his seat in the front row near the window, while his aide settled beside him. For a few moments, everything seemed normal again. But then the aide opened his tablet to check the seating list, a standard security procedure to review any recent changes. As he scanned through the names, one line caught his attention. Captain Henry Wallace, seat 28B, downgraded from business to economy, overbooked. Mr. Lawrence frowned slightly. He knew that name. He turned to the king and whispered, "Your Majesty, forgive me, but I believe there's been an unfortunate situation." The king looked up from his reading glasses. "Oh, what kind of situation?" "There's a gentleman named Captain Henry Wallace on board," the aide explained. "Victoria Cross recipient. He was originally booked in business class, but due to an airline error, he's been moved to economy." The king's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in disbelief. "Henry Wallace?" he repeated. "The same Wallace who served at Buckingham Palace for over 20 years? "Yes, Your Majesty," the aide confirmed. "He's attending the same remembrance event as you." There was a pause. The king set down his glasses, his voice calm but firm. "And they downgraded him?" "It appears so, sir," the aide said quietly. The king leaned back in his seat, deep in thought. He had always respected the service of men like Henry, quiet, loyal, and brave, the kind of people who held the country's spirit together. After a moment, he looked at his aide. "Find out where he's seated," he said softly. Mr. Lawrence nodded and walked toward the back, passing through the rows of passengers. He glanced discreetly at the seat numbers until he reached row 28. There, by the window, sat Captain Wallace, his hat neatly placed on his lap, looking out quietly at the clouds. Mr. Lawrence paused for a moment, feeling a sense of respect. Then he returned to the front and whispered to the king, "Seat 28B, sir. He's sitting near the rear." The king stood up slowly. The attendants looked startled. One of them quickly stepped forward. "Your Majesty, may I ask—" The king raised a gentle hand. "It's all right," he said. "I just wish to greet an old soldier." The entire cabin seemed to grow still as the king began walking down the narrow aisle. Passengers who recognized him gasped softly or froze in surprise. Phones lowered. Conversation stopped. The sudden quiet filled the cabin like a wave. Henry, unaware of what was happening, kept looking out the window until he heard a quiet stir around him. People were turning their heads, whispering. Then he heard a familiar, calm voice say, "Captain Henry Wallace." He turned and looked up, and there stood King Charles himself, just a few steps away, his eyes gentle but serious. For a second, Henry thought he was dreaming. He quickly stood up, his hand going to his hat. "Your Majesty," he said softly, bowing his head. The king smiled faintly. At ease, Captain. No need for formality. The passengers watched silently, their eyes wide. The king looked at Henry's medals and then at his face. I was told you were moved from your original seat, the king said. Henry hesitated, his tone respectful. Yes, sir. A small mistake, I suppose. It's quite all right. The king's expression softened, but there was a trace of sadness in his eyes. You have stood guard in the rain for your country. You have carried the weight of duty far longer than most. I do not believe you should be sitting here while I sit comfortably up front. Henry looked genuinely surprised. Your Majesty, please, that's not necessary. But before he could finish, the king gently placed a hand on his shoulder. Captain Wallace, he said softly, I insist. Would you do me the honor of sitting beside me? The cabin fell utterly silent. Some people put their hands to their mouths, others looked moved to tears. The attendant stood frozen, unsure what to do. Henry's lips trembled slightly. He didn't know what to say. Finally, he whispered, You honor me beyond words, sir. The king smiled kindly. You have already honored your nation beyond words, my friend. With that, the king turned and began walking back toward the front. Henry followed quietly beside him, his back straight, his medals glinting faintly in the cabin light. The two men, one a monarch, the other a soldier, walked side by side down the aisle. Passengers moved their legs aside to give them room. Many bowed their heads in quiet respect. When they reached the front cabin, the king gestured toward his own seat. Please, Captain Wallace, he said. Take this seat. Henry looked hesitant. Your Majesty, I cannot. You can, the king interrupted gently. Because sometimes honor must sit in the front, where it belongs. The king's aide arranged the seats quickly, and Henry sat down reluctantly beside the window. The king took the seat beside him instead of the one reserved for him alone. The attendant, still awestruck, brought water and tea for both men. For the rest of the flight, the two spoke quietly. The king asked about Henry's service, his years at the palace, his family. Henry answered humbly, always turning the conversation away from himself. But the king listened closely, showing deep respect for every word. The passengers could feel something special in the air. It wasn't about fame or royalty, it was about dignity. Every person on that plane would remember that moment. The sight of a king walking down the aisle to honor a soldier the world had nearly forgotten. As the engines hummed softly and the clouds drifted by, Henry felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of being seen, not for his medals but for his service, and deep inside, he felt quietly grateful that even in a world that moved too fast, honor still found its way to those who earned it. The cabin of the aircraft had never felt so silent. Every person on that flight could feel that something special was happening. The king himself was now seated beside Captain Henry Wallace, and there was a quiet warmth between them. The moment carried the weight of history, yet it was so gentle that it felt almost personal. Henry sat still, not out of stiffness, but because he could hardly believe what had just happened. A few minutes ago, he had been another passenger in the back of the plane. Now the King of the United Kingdom was sitting next to him, speaking with the kindness of an old friend. The flight attendants moved carefully, trying not to disturb the calm. They offered tea and biscuits, their hands trembling slightly. The king thanked them politely and turned to Henry. Tell me, Captain, do you still live near Windsor? Yes, Your Majesty, Henry answered quietly. I have a small cottage there. It's peaceful. I keep a garden and a few old books. The king smiled. That sounds lovely. I always thought peace is the real reward of service. Henry nodded. Peace and memories, sir. Some sweet, some heavy, but all worth having. The king looked thoughtful. You've carried those memories a long time, haven't you? Henry's eyes softened. Since I was 21, sir. Some nights I still hear the sounds of the marches and the bells from the palace, but those sounds remind me that duty never truly leaves a man. The king studied him for a moment. Duty and humility seem to follow you wherever you go. Henry smiled faintly. Humility is what keeps a man from forgetting who he serves. Around them, passengers tried not to stare, yet they couldn't look away for long. They saw a monarch and a soldier speaking quietly, sharing small smiles. Two lives meeting across different worlds but bound by the same sense of purpose. A little girl sitting across the aisle whispered to her father, Daddy, is that the king? Her father nodded, whispering back, Yes, and that man beside him is a hero. The girl's eyes grew wide. He looks kind, she said. Henry noticed the child's gaze and gave her a gentle wave. She smiled shyly and hid behind her father's shoulder. The king chuckled softly. "You still inspire courage in the young, Captain." Henry smiled. "Children see goodness faster than grown-ups, sir. They don't need medals to recognize it." The king nodded slowly, clearly moved. The flight continued peacefully. Outside, the clouds had parted, and a golden light spread across the wings of the plane. The pilot's calm voice announced that they were flying above the Scottish border and would be landing soon. The king looked down the aisle where Henry had been sitting earlier. The empty seat in the back seemed to shine in his mind like a small reminder. He turned to his aide, Mr. Lawrence, who sat nearby, and said quietly, "Make sure that when we land, this man receives the welcome he deserves." "Yes, Your Majesty," Lawrence replied. Henry noticed the short exchange but didn't ask. He didn't like to be treated differently. Yet deep inside, there was a quiet gratitude he couldn't describe. He turned to the window and saw the rolling hills of Scotland below. They looked soft and endless, touched by sunlight. "It's beautiful," he murmured. The king followed his gaze. "It is," he agreed. "And it stays beautiful because of men like you, Henry." Henry hesitated for a moment before saying, "With respect, sir, it stays beautiful because the people love this land. I only guarded the gates. They're the ones who make the kingdom worth guarding." The king smiled in admiration. "You remind me why the crown depends on men of heart, not just rank." For a moment, both men sat in silence, watching the horizon. The sound of the engines was soft, steady, almost like a heartbeat. A few rows back, the businessman who had spoken briefly with Henry earlier watched in quiet wonder. He remembered how he had barely paid attention to the medals before. Now he felt a small sting of guilt. He leaned toward his wife and whispered, "That man carries more honor in his silence than most of us ever will." His wife nodded. Sometimes it takes a king to remind people what respect means. When the flight attendants returned to check the cabin before descent, the king thanked each of them warmly, using their names. They were touched by his humility, but even more by how he kept glancing at Henry with genuine regard. One of them whispered later, "I'll never forget this flight." As the plane began to descend, the clouds turned pink with the late morning light. Henry looked out again and thought of all the times he had flown before, usually alone, quietly, without anyone noticing him. But this flight was different. It was as if life had decided to give him one last moment of recognition, not for glory, but for grace. He thought of his late wife, who used to tell him, "The world may not always say thank you, but one day it will show it." He smiled softly, feeling that maybe this was that day. The landing gear lowered, and the engines rumbled as the aircraft glided toward the runway. The captain's voice came through again, calm and clear, thanking the passengers for flying and reminding them to stay seated after landing. Henry took a deep breath. "Thank you for your kindness, sir," he said to the king. "You didn't have to do this." The king looked at him kindly. "Captain Wallace, I did exactly what was right. You've spent your life standing for others. Today someone needed to stand for you." Henry's eyes grew moist, but he quickly blinked away the emotion. "You have given me an honor I'll remember for the rest of my days," he said quietly. The king placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "It's not an honor, Henry, it's gratitude. And I hope the people watching will remember what it means to respect those who serve." The plane touched down smoothly on the runway. Applause suddenly broke out from several rows of passengers. It wasn't for the landing. It was for what they had just witnessed. The simple act of respect had touched every heart on board. Some clapped softly, some wiped away quiet tears. The king turned to Henry and smiled. "It seems they agree." Henry looked around, humbled and surprised. "I'm not sure I deserve all this," he said softly. The king answered, "You deserve more than applause, Captain. You deserve remembrance." When the seatbelt light turned off, everyone waited as the king and Henry stood together. The attendants opened the door, and a small group of officials and photographers were waiting outside for the king's arrival, unaware of what had happened on the plane. But when the door opened and they saw the king step out side by side with a decorated royal guard, the scene changed instantly. The king motioned for Henry to walk beside him instead of behind him. The flash of cameras began, but the king ignored them. He turned to Henry and said quietly, "Let them see that real greatness wears humility." They walked down the steps together. the morning breeze lifting Henry's uniform slightly. The reporters whispered to each other, trying to understand the moment. The sight of the king offering his hand to help the old soldier down the final step became an image that would travel around the world within hours. As they reached the ground, the king paused. He looked at Henry and said, "We'll ride together to the ceremony." Henry shook his head softly. "Your Majesty, please, I'm fine." The king smiled gently. "It's already settled." And so, as the car door opened, the two men entered side by side. The crowd around them grew silent for a moment, touched by what they saw, not a show of power but of respect. Inside the car, Henry looked out at the airport fading behind them and said quietly, "I didn't think the day would bring so much kindness." The king replied, "Kindness has a way of finding the deserving." The car moved on toward the city, and though the world outside hurried on as usual, everyone who had been on that plane carried with them a story, one about honor, humility, and the quiet reminder that even in modern times, true respect still finds its voice. The car moved through the quiet streets of Edinburgh, the morning light spilling across the rooftops. Inside the royal vehicle, Captain Henry Wallace sat beside King Charles, still in disbelief at what had just happened. He kept looking out the window, trying to make sense of the moment. The city outside looked peaceful, people walking, children heading to school, flags waving in the soft breeze. Yet inside his heart, everything felt heavy and bright at the same time. The king noticed Henry's silence and spoke gently. "You're thinking too much again, aren't you?" Henry smiled faintly. "Old habits, sir. A soldier never quite learns how to rest his mind." The king chuckled softly. "I suppose that's true. But today you should let your heart rest. You've carried the weight of service long enough." Henry looked down at his hands, the wrinkles of age showing years of work, dedication, and sacrifice. "It's strange, Your Majesty," he said quietly. "For so many years I've stood for others. And today someone stood for me. It feels unreal." The king nodded thoughtfully. "True honor always finds its way back to those who've given it to others. You may not see it every day, but it never disappears." The car moved past rows of people waiting near the Royal Mile, many holding flags and flowers for the remembrance event. As they saw the royal car approach, they waved and smiled, unaware of the story that had unfolded just an hour before. When the car stopped near the ceremony grounds, officials and guards stood ready to greet the king. But to their surprise, when the doors opened, the king stepped out and turned first toward Henry, extending his hand. Cameras flashed and people began whispering. The image was striking, a monarch helping an aging soldier step out of the car, both walking side by side toward the memorial. The event took place in a large courtyard surrounded by flags, flowers, and the sound of a distant military band. Rows of veterans stood proudly in their uniforms, medals gleaming under the sunlight. Henry recognized a few old faces in the crowd, men he had served with decades ago. They looked at him in surprise when they saw him walking beside the king. Some saluted, others smiled proudly, understanding that something extraordinary had happened. As they reached the front row, the king gestured for Henry to stand beside him rather than behind. "Today you stand here as my equal," he said quietly. "You have earned that place." Henry hesitated for a moment, then bowed his head humbly. "Your Majesty, that is the greatest honor of my life." The ceremony began with silence, one that carried meaning deeper than words. The band played softly, and the voices of a choir rose gently across the courtyard. Flowers were placed near the memorial stone where the names of fallen soldiers were engraved. When it came time for speeches, the king stepped forward to speak. His voice carried calm strength as he addressed the crowd. "Today we honor those who served, those who gave everything for peace. We remember not just their courage, but their humility, their quiet devotion to duty." He paused and looked toward Henry. "This morning I was reminded of what that devotion truly means. Sometimes in a world that moves too fast, we forget the faces behind the medals, the hands that have built the very safety we live in, but they are still among us, walking quietly, never asking for recognition, and it is our duty to see them." The audience listened in stillness. Some wiped tears, others nodded solemnly. The king's words felt real, not like a speech written for ceremony, but like one spoken from the heart. Henry stood silently beside him, his eyes glistening. He had never sought the spotlight, But that day he understood that the king's gesture wasn't about fame. It was about remembrance, not for him alone, but for every soldier who had ever been overlooked. When the ceremony ended, the king placed a hand on Henry's shoulder and whispered, "The story of this morning will reach far beyond this courtyard, and I hope it reminds people of the respect they owe to those who served." Henry smiled softly. "If it helps even one young person remember, sir, that will be enough." Later, as they walked back toward the car, reporters stood quietly at a distance, their cameras capturing every step. One of them asked respectfully, "Captain Wallace, how does it feel to sit beside the king today?" Henry paused, looked toward the crowd, and answered in his calm, humble way, "It feels like my country remembered me, and that's more than enough." The king smiled proudly beside him. By the afternoon, the story had already begun spreading. Passengers from the flight had shared what they had witnessed, photos, messages, and short videos online. Within hours, the world was talking about it. News outlets showed the picture of King Charles walking down the aisle, his hand on the shoulder of the old soldier. Headlines spoke of respect, humility, and a lesson in honor. People from across the world commented, calling it one of the most touching royal gestures in recent years. But Henry didn't see any of that. He had no interest in fame or news. He was back in his cottage by the next day, sitting on his small wooden chair near the garden, watching the wind move through the flowers. A knock came at his door. When he opened it, he found a delivery man holding a small package wrapped neatly with a royal seal. Inside was a handwritten note. It read, "To Captain Henry Wallace, thank you for reminding this nation of the quiet strength that holds it together. Your dignity is the crown's pride, Charles R." Beside the note was a small framed photograph, a still image from the flight, showing the moment when the king placed his hand on Henry's shoulder. Henry looked at the picture for a long time, his eyes soft but full of emotion. He set it on his table beside his old medals. For the first time in years, he felt truly seen. In the days that followed, letters began to arrive from strangers, students, veterans, and ordinary citizens. They wrote to thank him for his service, for his patience, and for showing the world what real honor looked like. Some said they shared the story with their children. Others said they cried reading it. Henry read each letter carefully, smiling at the kind words. One evening, his neighbor, a young teacher, stopped by to visit. "Mr. Wallace," she said gently, "my class saw your story on the news. The children wanted me to tell you that they now stand straighter during the morning anthem because of you." Henry laughed softly, his eyes shining with quiet joy. "Then it was worth everything," he said. He walked her to the gate, the evening light painting golden lines across the sky. As he looked out toward the horizon, he thought of the king's words again, about respect, remembrance, and gratitude. The next morning, as he watered his garden, an elderly neighbor passing by said, "Henry, you've become a national hero." Henry smiled warmly and shook his head. "No, I've just been lucky to live in a time where kindness still matters." He went back inside, placed his cap on the table, and sat down with a cup of tea. The sunlight came through the window, resting gently on the framed photo beside his medals. It wasn't the uniform or the Victoria Cross that made him proud that day. It was the small reminder that respect still lived in people's hearts. The world around him had changed, but some things had not. Courage still inspired, humility still touched hearts, and kindness still had power. And somewhere deep in his heart, Henry knew that what had happened on that flight was never about a seat or a mistake. It was about remembering that true greatness is not measured by where you sit, but by how you stand when life tests your grace. For Captain Henry Wallace, that day became a story not of pride, but of peace, a reminder that even the simplest act of respect can echo far beyond the moment it was given. And for everyone who heard his story, it became a lesson they would never forget, that honor, when shown with kindness, becomes something that lives forever.